Hello, and welcome to the Ohio Resource Center's Science Instructional Strategies, a look at the OGT webcast, and more specifically, what do wrong answers tell us? I'm Terry Shiverdecker, Science Content Specialist for the Ohio Resource Center for Mathematics, Science, and Reading, also known as ORC. Today we will be discussing available Ohio graduation test data, where to find it, and how the data can be used to inform instruction. We'll also discuss student misconceptions as well as the importance of formative assessment. This program is one of a series of 5 webcasts dealing with science instructional strategies and the OGT. But before we begin, I'd like to draw your attention to the features located on the webcast interface. You may have noticed the Submit a Question button to the right side of the screen. Submit your question at any time and we'll answer as many as we can at the end of the live program. Also, in the lower half of the screen, you'll find support materials related to our topic today. These materials include the What Do Wrong Answers Tell Us article, several mini collections, and related video tutorials. These items can be accessed at any point during our webcast and will continue to be available, as well as information about other webcasts in this series on the Science Instructional Strategies, a look at the OGT webpage. That URL is www.ohio.org/4/science/OGT. Now I'd like to introduce our 2 panelists joining us for today's discussion, Dave Schellhaus and Pat Barron. Dave is the Science Curriculum Specialist for the Darke County Educational Service Center. He taught high school science for 11 years before moving to his current position. He has earned national board certification and was involved in writing the science standards and other state initiatives. Pat is the director of the Teaching and Learning Collaborative and has worked as a professional development consultant for many years. Pat has had extensive involvement in many state initiatives, including participation in writing the science standards and in the development of the OSI professional development materials. Both Pat and Dave are members of the ORC Science Review Board. Dave, Pat, welcome.
Thank you.
Glad to be here.
Well, let's get started by talking a little bit about item analysis. What information is available for each item? Before you respond to that, I'd like to clarify for our audience that we use the term item and question interchangeably throughout this series.
Well, Terry, when we look at item analysis, what we're looking at is test data that we look at each individual response that the students had the option of choosing, and we can tell how many students chose A, how many students chose B. The example I could give you is from the March 2005 test where there was a question on a box sliding down an inclined plane. And the item analysis data there says that 62% of the students selected the correct answer where the potential energy was the greatest at the top. And then from there, 10% of them selected another answer that said that the potential energy is constant. And then 16% said that it was greatest at the midway mark. And then 12% said it was greatest at the bottom. So that's basically what we're looking at in a multiple choice item analysis data.
Okay, so that's the information available for a multiple choice item. What about the short answer and extended response?
It's somewhat similar to what Dave was describing. What the principals and curriculum folks and teachers will receive is a breakdown of the scores that each student, or that the percent of students get from students who didn't respond at all up to 2 points or 4 points, depending on whether it's short answer or extended response. So, for example, there was a question on the March 2006 test where students were supposed to describe an advantage and a disadvantage of using an herbicide. They would get back data something like this. 4% of students did not respond, 21% scored 0 points, 12% got 1/2 point, 20% got 1 point, and so forth. So you can see it gives them a pretty detailed idea of exactly where students answered and where their misconceptions might be.
And the main thing that teachers might ask the question is, how do we get those 1/2 points? And those 1/2 points actually come because each extended response or short answer question is scored by 2 people or 2 scorers, and they average those 2 scores out, and that gives you the 1/2 point. So that's sometimes a question a lot of teachers have.
Okay, good. That's good to know. So the data that you just shared with us, that comes from the state data, from how students who responded to the items did across the state. Where can teachers go to find item analysis data for their own districts?
Well, most curriculum supervisors have that. You can also access some of that data through the ODE's website, which is the Success website. And there, if you have a district username and password, which you can get from an administrator, you have access to all of your district's item analysis for the OGT or the OATs or any of those.
And that's available at no cost?
Yes, that's no cost.
Okay, great.
And building principals also almost always have that data, and many will sit down with their teachers in grade level groups or individually and actually go through their individual student data with them. So there are a lot of ways that teachers can find out how their kids are doing.
Okay, very good. Now we've talked a little bit about what kind of information is available in the item analysis and where we can find that information. Dave, how can we use this information to inform instruction?
Well, as you're looking at the item analysis data, you're obviously going to be looking at what percentage of the students answered the correct answer versus the incorrect answers. And a lot of times when we look at item analysis, we tend to kind of always look at the negative. You know, how many kids didn't get this question correct? But I think we sometimes need to start with the positive and look at what questions did our students do well on. And once we figure that out, we can kind of go back and talk about, well, why do we think they did so well? I just was working with a district recently where we were looking at their item analysis data, and a few questions their kids got 92% correct, and which is excellent. And that's what all districts would like to see. And so I tried to ask them, what do they think resulted in those test scores for that question? What instructional strategies were they using? What were they doing in class? Because obviously what they did worked. And
right.
A lot of times when you see that type of data, you need to make sure that you do kind of reflect back on, well, what did I do in the classroom? Because obviously something went right.
Mm-hmm.
And then use that to maybe impact those negative scores that we look at and say, well, our kids only got 40% of the correct answer on this question, and reflect back, well, what did I do there? And then could I do something similar to what I did before in those questions that we looked at earlier?
Okay, good. So we want to look at what the positive results and how we might replicate those instructional strategies other places, and particularly we want to think about how we can replicate those where our results may not have been as strong.
Right, and I think the other thing you need to look at as a teacher is when you're looking at those answers, not only is that just going to tell us whether they got it right or wrong, we're also going to be able to tell possibly some misconceptions that the students had, because it's important that we identify those extremely early.
Okay, great. So Pat, Dave just mentioned misconceptions. Tell us a little bit about misconceptions and the implications for instruction.
Sure. There's been an awful lot written about misconceptions, and many people have probably seen the video of the Harvard students at their graduation ceremony where they are just absolutely positively convinced that it's hotter in the summer because the sun and the earth are closer to each other, which of course is not true, and that's a huge misconception. The current term now for misconceptions is alternate frameworks. And the reason they're starting to try to use that terminology a little more is that sometimes students will not have a total misconception. There'll be maybe some of their thinking that is correct and scientifically valid, but not all of it. And so that kind of hedges a little bit and opens that up some. Misconceptions are usually formed fairly early. It can be as a result of observations the kids are making and kind of leaps they're making in their minds about things, or maybe they hear bits and pieces of information and they kind of put it together incorrectly in their mind. And not only are they formed early, they're very tightly held by students and adults. Obviously, the Harvard students held the misconception way up through. So this is an issue for high school teachers as well as elementary teachers. A couple implications for us in our teaching. First of all, we have to understand what the misconceptions are that the students are holding. That way we have some idea of how to counteract those. So once we know what those misconceptions are, then we want to kind of build a conceptual bridge, if you will, between their idea and the idea that that is scientifically correct. Because just telling them that they're wrong and that they have a misconception isn't likely to actually cause them to adopt the more correct scientific explanation.
Okay.
That's a good point, Pat, and I think that's something that teachers really have to keep in mind when dealing with those misconceptions, because what happens is if we do just tell them that, that's not how it is scientifically, without giving them the opportunity to really explore it hands-on themselves so that they can come to that realization that they're wrong. A lot of times those misconceptions are never reversed, so it is extremely important in the instruction.
So we know that students may come to class with alternative frameworks, that they hold on to those alternative ideas unless they have opportunities to explore and do some hands-on, minds-on work to kind of shake those alternative frameworks. Dave, how can alternative frameworks or misconceptions be identified?
Well, as a teacher, it's extremely important that we're always looking at our students' understanding, and we have to make sure that we're constantly gauging their understanding through the learning process. And formative assessment is the best way to keep tabs on, what does the student understand, what don't they understand, what misconceptions might they have. And by doing that formative assessment, you're not grading them, you're just doing this for your information. It's assessment for the learning process, not of the learning. We're focusing only on, do they get it, do they understand it? For instance, they may have a misconception about the atomic model, the atomic structure, which kids typically have. And because it's such an abstract concept, it's very difficult sometimes to know if the kids really understand what an atomic structure is with the electron cloud and the nucleus and all the electrons. And unless you're doing some type of formative assessment, having them model it, or having some other alternative types of instruction or assessment strategies, you may never get at their misconceptions. So the formative assessment is extremely important.
Okay. So that's one of the ways we can identify a misconception is through some formative assessment. Pat, now we've mentioned formative assessment. Tell us a little bit more about formative assessment. How's it used in the classroom, and why is it so important?
There's one author I was reading had a real great example of what we often would think of as the two types of assessment. There's summative assessment, and then there's formative assessment. So the example that this author gave was of applying this to plants. And so if you have a plant and you measure how high the plant is at the end of the growing season, that's a summative assessment. You have one marking point, you have one number, you have a summation, if you will, of the plant growth. On the other hand, the formative assessment is more like using water and fertilizer to help the plant grow. You add a little water, grows pretty well, you add some fertilizer, add a little bit more water, so that it's a lot more incremental and ongoing and not just the summative end assessment. So I think that's the way teachers need to think about formative assessment, is it really needs to be tightly embedded in the instruction, and also something that's purposefully done. There's a really good book that just came out from ASCD, and they did a real nice job of organizing formative assessment into some categories, and I want to kind of walk through those, because I think the term formative assessment can be intimidating to teachers, and it doesn't have to be complicated. It can often be a very simple, quick thing to do and still yield them a lot of results. So one of the categories of formative assessment from this book, which is called I don't know what the book's called.
We can come back to
Thank you. It will come back to me at any rate. Is listening to oral language. And there's some very simple strategies for that. One's called a think, pair, share. And so I would actually write down my thoughts on a science concept. I might share with my partner a little bit, and we'd talk about it, and then we'd share with the whole class. So a very quick, simple way that the teacher can see what the students are thinking about that.
Hey, Pat, is that book the new ASCD book, Checking for Understanding?
Checking for Understanding.
Okay, yeah,
Thank you very much.
That's a great one.
That's it, exactly. Yep. And they're the ones that came up with these categories. Thank you. Another thing that teachers can do in this kind of oral language is really to watch their students for those nonverbal cues. So if the kids are kind of looking puzzled, and that seems like real natural for teachers to do, but you want to just not ignore that and really to act on it if you're seeing a lot of teachers that are a lot of students that are there. And in all the students talking about science, we want to always be pressing for clarification and for them to really explain what they're saying in their own words. A second cluster that's from this book is using questions. And again, this can be very simple, quick strategy. many classrooms have those whiteboards where you can write on them with a marker and then erase them, and you can ask the kids to write their answer to a question, and they kind of hold it up, and a real quick scan for a teacher to see how on base their students are or aren't. Another real simple one is hand signals. I totally get the concept, and maybe I get it a little bit. Nope, don't get it at all. So again, a couple very quick and easy ways to do it. One of the, I think, kind of fun ones that's come up more recently is an automated response systems. That's where they have those little clickers that the kids can say, what do you think the answer to this question is? Click. And then the teacher can very quickly see if the students are on base or not.
And I think the important piece of those strategies that you said is the instantaneous feedback,
yes.
and that's extremely important for kids, I think.
So the teacher knows immediately whether he or she needs to do some reteaching or reiterating or restating or whatever.
And that thumbs up, thumbs down, thumbs sideways, I've seen that in action. It's very effective, and it allows the teacher to do a real quick survey of how are the kids doing here.
Exactly. Another cluster of formative assessment strategies is using writing, and it's very powerful, the research says, when students are actually, in their own words, summarizing concepts and topics. We talked a little earlier about using notebooks and such, but that is a good strategy. Doesn't have to be a lot of writing, but something that the teacher can scan quickly and get the understanding. And there's entrance and exit slips of the same thing. Projects and performances is another cluster. We often think of those as something pretty major and kind of a big culminating experience for the end of the unit. And it can be that they actually can be more simple and intermittent in the unit, so that the teacher can actually use the feedback from those experiences to inform the instruction and how the student's doing as well. So that could be things like photo essays, electronic portfolios, visual displays, all kinds of things like that. But apparently it's very good for the student to apply some of their knowledge to a novel new situation, and that really helps them cement that knowledge for themselves. And I suppose the final one is TESS as a cluster, kind of our old friend, TESS. And of course that, again, is a very valid formative assessment strategy, but not when it's the only test that's given is the very end of the chapter or the unit. So for TESS to be helpful, they have to be given, again, intermittently throughout the instruction.
Okay, great. I really like that plant analogy, Pat. I think that really helps us kind of think about what we do along the way to kind of grow that knowledge and so on. Also, the point about writing. Our students are asked to write on the OGT with a short answer and extended response. I think that provides them some good practice and perhaps build their comfort level a little bit in expressing their scientific knowledge in a written form. So we've received several questions from our viewers, and I'd like to share some of those with you. And then if you would just respond, that'd be great. How can you motivate students to at least try the extended response questions? I've heard many students say that they did not even bother to try.
Well, Terry, that is an epidemic, unfortunately, or in a lot of the districts and a lot of the data that I've looked at. There is a lot of those high numbers of kids that don't even attempt it, and it is alarming. And I think, in my mind, the thing that we have to really strive to do for kids and helping them be proficient at least attempting those extended response questions is give the kids the support they need, whether that's different strategies such as a 3-column method or some types of organizers where they feel that they're confident enough to attempt that. And the other thing I think that sometimes we overlook as educators is that when we have kids answer extended response or short answer questions, typically they're always graded. They're always assessed.
Right.
And if I'm a student that's not particularly good at that, and that's not a skill that I'm strong in, and I get assessed and graded all the time, eventually I get to the point where I know what I'm going to do because I've been graded since I've been, in second grade. And there's no sense in me to even try this. So I think sometimes we have to give the kids just a safe environment in which to write so that they at least get proficient and feel comfortable putting things on paper.
Yeah, those are all very good tips. Pat, this one's for you. What is an exit and entrance slip?
They would be very simple prompts that as the kids are coming into the room, that'd be an entrance slip. As they're coming into the room, that'd be the first thing that they would do. to write a quick answer to whatever that prompt is. It could be, what is something that you know about the ecosystem. I mean, it could be something related to the content. If it's an answer slip, it could be something related to the prior day's content. Exit slip the same way. It's a very quick way for a teacher to monitor the content for that day's lesson, and if there was something, what are 3 key points that you think we learned today? And that would be an exit ticket.
So a student, let's say they had a little confusion, some things were a little unclear on one day, they could come in the next day and an entrance slip could be a question about the previous day's material.
And sometimes it can be as simple as a reflection in terms of letting them reflect on their own understanding. What did you understand? What didn't you understand? Just so that they can kind of think that in their own mind.
And it is, you're right, it's a very quick way to find out what your students know, what they're thinking. And again, it comes back to, Dave, to what you talked about earlier about a safe environment. Some kids are hesitant to ask the questions in class, so creating that safe environment is always important. So here's another question. What types of things can I do in the classroom to get students to apply what they know?
Well, that's it's sometimes a difficult challenge, but I think you really have to give them engaging work that they can see a relevant context for. I think sometimes in science we don't always give kids the opportunity to engage in work that is real life. I think you really have to look at doing some projects that deal with real life science context, where whether it's picking up the USA Today and seeing cloning or stem cells. There's a lot of science in the news today, and I think if we can engage them in some of that content and then use that to engage them in the content that we want them to learn for the OGT and the science standards, I think that's the way to go.
Well, and Terry, I would just build on what Dave's saying and also say that if the kids can have some choices about how they apply that, what the context and format is, and even perhaps in some cases what the content is that they apply, I think that will cause them to be more engaged in actually thinking that through.
Okay. Here's a question a little bit different bent. I noticed that certain questions on the OGT are not released. Are these questions scored in the test? And if so, what percentage of the questions are usually correctly answered?
There's always going to be a certain number of items that aren't released, and those won't be released, and you won't have data for those. A lot of times when you get your item analysis data, it may go up to number 16, and then it will jump to number 25, and it's those items that they may use. They basically field test those items so that they can be used on a future test. So we usually do not get data for those.
Right. And it's my understanding those field test items that aren't released do not count in the student's score.
No, they do.
They're simply being there to do exactly what you said, just to field test the item.
There are some items that aren't field test items and also aren't released.
For the OAT, but I think most of the OGTs are released. But you're right, the OATs will not be.
Okay. There's lots of different types of formative assessment. Portfolios, journals, science notebooks, concept maps, etc. are some of those types. If you had to pick one that you think best prepares students for the OGT, which one would it be and why?
Well, there's a lot of good ones there. It's kind of hard to pick one there. My bias would be towards science notebooks, just for the fact that it creates that safe environment that I was talking about earlier, about a safe place to write, because in a science notebook we ask kids to write their thoughts. We ask them to make conclusions and predictions and actually really sometimes do reflections, and in a place where they feel that it's safe, because a lot of times in most science notebooks we're not assessing the writing, we're looking more at the process and are they getting it. And the other thing I think science notebooks do well that we need for the OGT is just getting proficient at looking at data, looking at graphs and charts, and being able to make conclusions based on that data, because you can look at the OGT and see all kinds of questions over those, and I think it's extremely important that kids get that opportunity to do that in a real life context, and I think the science notebooks do that.
Not only looking at data, but also generating data and generating graphs and learning how to manipulate that and understand what it means.
I do think it's an important point, though. I really agree with you, Dave, about the notebooks. I do think it's an important point not to have them be just a place where the lab write-ups are situated, but more the rich types of writing as you were describing.
Okay. Pat, you talked about several different categories that formative assessments fit into, and this question falls under that. Do all formative assessments fit into one of the categories described by Pat?
I don't know that I could say every single one you could think of. I think what we've got in these categories that ASCD has clustered here are the dominant ones. And the reason I thought that would be nice for teachers to see the range of those is that there are a variety of different ways. Is that every single one? I don't know. I'd have to think about that.
Yeah. And this one deals with misconceptions. Is there a website, book, etc., where I can find out about what common misconceptions students have?
I believe there are several websites out there, and I think the ORC has some references to those that people can check on the website. And I believe there's some books that might be listed there in the collections as well. The title escapes me right now, unless you can. I don't remember that title, but there's a very good book I think that we have in the collection on the website.
Yeah, so. There is, and there's also on the ORC website on this. There's misconceptions related to some of the work done around the program models. Pat, do you know the name of that book?
Yes, it's called Making Sense of Secondary Science, Looking into Children's Ideas. And when they talk about secondary, they're actually talking about a very wide range of grades, but that's
right.
It's a book, and it's actually listed in the article that's attached to the site where this webcast is.
And, as you mentioned earlier when we were talking about misconceptions, that a misconception may be learned or alternative framework early in a child's education or in their own thinking about the way the world works. And we tend to hold on to those misconceptions pretty tightly. The fact that the misconception might be something that we find in 11 or 12-year-olds doesn't mean it's not applicable for high school kids,
right.
because we do tend to hold on to those things that we don't understand.
Exactly.
Here's a question dealing with how to work with kids in an electronic environment. I am an online teacher with ECOT, and how can we implement these ideas in an electronic classroom? Any strategies?
Well, I think a lot of the formative assessment strategies that Pat showed or explained to us could be done in an online environment. I think you can have an online journaling where they do have some reflections, that you can do concept mapping, you can do a lot of those things. And and with online, sometimes if the person's online in real time, we can do IM and chatting and give some that clicker, but online right away. So I think there's several strategies you could use.
Yeah, I think so too. I think you did a nice job with that. And I think this will be our last question for the day. How does formative assessment work in inquiry lessons?
Well, I think that it really comes down to using that formative assessment all the way through the learning cycle. And the learning cycle, or the 5 E's, or whatever you want to refer to it as, there's a lot of things in the literature out there, but I think you're going to have to use that formative assessment all the way through the learning cycle, at the beginning, the middle, so that you can constantly gauge the student's understanding. And I believe there's an upcoming webcast on that and another article, I think, in this collection. So I think those types of resources would be very helpful to teachers in terms of dealing with those.
Yeah, you're right. We do have, in December, we have a webcast dealing with inquiry and the learning cycle, and how we can use some of these released OGT items in learning cycle lessons. So I think that would be a very productive venue for this particular person to join us, and we can provide more in-depth answer at that time. And that's all the questions we have time for now. Dave, any final key points that you'd like to share?
Well, I really think that teachers, when they look at their item analysis data, don't look at it always in the critical light. Even though we have to do that and we have to find the weaknesses in maybe our instructional program, but we really need to look at our positives as well, because there's a lot of things that teachers are doing well out there, and I think we need to accentuate those to make sure that we know why the kids are doing well on certain items and tie it back to the instructional strategy, so that we can then replicate that with the other ones that may be a little weaker than that. And I think that's the important piece.
You've mentioned that before, and I do think it's very important to point out the positive things and what we're doing well, and using those to kind of bring up some of the things where we need to work on it a little bit. Pat, do you have anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, I think I'd just really like to encourage teachers to consciously plan into their lessons both uncovering of misconceptions and the use of formative assessment. It may be a little different than things that they've done before, but I think it could pay really huge benefits for their kids.
Yeah, embedding those formative assessments is just critical. Okay, well, thank you, Dave and Pat, very much for participating today.
Thank you. We enjoyed it.
Thank you for your participation and email questions. In this webcast, we've discussed item analysis, information that is available for released OGT items, looked at some of the ways this information can be used to inform instruction, and talked a bit about misconceptions in formative assessment. We've just scratched the surface on these topics, so don't forget to check the supporting materials available on this interface and also on the Science Instructional Strategies, A Look at the OGT. And again, that URL is www.ohiorc.org/4/science/OGT. If you would like to learn more about these topics or work collaboratively with ORC and your building or district to plan professional development programs, please contact ORC at web@ohiorc.org. For the Ohio Resource Center, I'm Terry Shiverdecker, wishing you success with all of your science instructional strategies.